So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Ooh, the slide just disappeared. I'm not sure. There we go. It's back. I'm Sandro Galea. I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the School of Public Health at Boston University. And welcome to everybody in person and online. This is one of our regular school-wide events where we host a number of events that feature leading thinkers about topics of contemporary concern. Today's event is part of our annual Shine lecture. And just a quick note about the Shine lecture. Cathy Shine had been treated in an emergency department and had been traumatized by that experience and became a leading advocate for patients' rights. She did a number of things that have had significant implications for patients' rights ever since. And in her memory, Ian and Deborah Shine have continued that work as well as establishing this lecture. So we try every year under the leadership of our Center for Law, Ethics, and Human Rights to bring forward a speaker who can speak broadly to the theme of patients' rights, patients' advocacy, and how we make sure that our system protects and promotes health rather than does the opposite. I will let Professor Mariner, who's a professor in health policy, to introduce today's speakers. Wendy.
Thank you, Dean Galea. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce David Soley. David Soley is a partner in the law firm of Bernstein, Shur in its Portland, Maine office, and he leads the real estate litigation group there. And he's a member of the American Bar Foundation. But he is here today because he has the experience and expertise in constitutional litigation. He spent over 4 years as a trial lawyer in Washington, D.C., before he returned to Maine. And in his years as a trial lawyer, he specialized in complex litigation, handling some of the largest companies in the United States, but importantly for our purposes, he has trials in both federal and state courts in constitutional cases involving drug testing, pregnancy testing, mandatory jury fees, congressional term limits, prison headgear policies, and Ebola quarantine. This is the subject that we are here to hear about today, and I think we will learn that the field of public health needs trial lawyers and judges just as much as it needs the scientific side of public health. Mr. Soley really exemplified the legal profession's dedication to justice and human rights when he represented Kaci Hickox in when the state of Maine sought to quarantine her after she returned from working for Médecins Sans Frontières as a nurse. This is a hard job, litigation, and I know trial lawyers are not the most popular in medical centers, but they do have some value. They can save us. And litigation is an incredibly demanding, disruptive, deadline-driven, hair-tearing sort of profession. So I have to add that Mr. Soley has co-authored the book, The Trial Lawyer's Guide to Success and Happiness. So I want to ask him, what is the trial lawyer's guide to success and happiness? I would like to hear that. But in the meantime, we're going to hear from whatever he wants to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After I finished my 200th trial, I decided, am I happy? Am I going to, what do I need to do to be happy? And as I thought through these things, after practicing law for 30-some years and doing endless trials, I wrote a book about which things make you happy, which things don't make you happy, and a pattern for having a fun life. Of all the trials that I've done, one of the most interesting cases that I had involved Ebola, and that's the story that I would like to talk to you about today. Mass hysteria, it's something that comes to America from time to time. It's been here many times. And how do we deal with irrational fear? How do we deal with hysteria? And also, this fear in public health cases has a profound effect on public health workers. And the Ebola case is a story about how we deal with that fear In this case, we had a good outcome, but we don't always have a good outcome. America, I think, is a great country, but we are buffeted by and plagued by hysteria from time to time. The most famous case was only a few miles from here, the Salem witch trials, 1692 to 1693. In that massive hysteria moment, 20 people were prosecuted and executed for witchcraft, just a few miles from Boston. 5 other people died in prison, including 2 infants. It was a case of just hysteria taking over and telling everyone what to do and nobody thinking. In the 20th century, we have had the Red Scare, and maybe there were some legitimate issues, maybe there weren't, but during the first Red Scare, which was in the 1917 to 1920 time frame, and also was also the same time as a pandemic, there were thousands, tens of thousands of innocent people that were put in jail throughout this country without thought, without thinking. Closer to our lifetime, and there was our second Red Scare in the 1950s, and this was McCarthyism, and many of you will remember parts of that. But we had the same thing, people losing their jobs, their careers, their reputation based on hysteria. And in our own lifetime, or in everybody's lifetime, I believe, we had the AIDS scare. And this is something that I think now is touching on more home, and I think involved a lot of the people here in the audience. There was a time in America that many, many Americans were scared of gay people. People were scared of Haitians. They were scared of touching anybody that might be Haitian, that might be gay. And we lived through this. And actually, this slide here is an actual quarantine notice that was put out in Texas to try to quarantine people who were gay because of the concern that they might have AIDS. And we, as a country, are often going to be living through this. We're going to be buffeted by this all the time. And we need to try to figure out where we stand, how we're going to deal with these things, and how we're going to get along as Americans. But the story is not about any of those issues. It's about the Ebola scare, which came to America in 2015, very recently. What you're looking at is a picture of the culprit. This is the Ebola virus. Ebola is formerly known as Ebola hemorrhagic fever. It is spread by contact with fluids, feces, vomiting, blood, and it is not airborne. It is spread by fluids, and people who get Ebola can have a very miserable death. It's a scary death. It's a miserable death. The death rate in Africa varied between 10% and 90%. On average, at the most recent Ebola outbreak, the death rate was over half. And this was a very scary thing because it had a very high death rate. It had a very miserable death. Ebola most recently struck in West Africa. And this is the area shown on the slide here where Ebola came. It came to Guinea, it came to Liberia, and it came to Sierra Leone. And it started in 2014, and it was the most serious outbreak of Ebola that we'd ever seen in the world. There were 28,000 suspected and confirmed cases of Ebola. There were 11,300 deaths, and over 10% of the people who died were people in the public health or in the health profession. These were essentially the first responders, the nurses, the doctors, the people that ran hospitals and worked in hospitals. After this plague hit, over 1,000 of those people who were trying to help other people died. It brought the hospitals in these countries to a standstill. It brought the economies of these countries to a standstill. All business stopped in these countries in West Africa. Anything coming in and out was forbidden. Their internal economies all collapsed. Their hospitals had nothing left because so many good people had died in the hospitals. The WHO, that's the World Health Organization, they put out a desperate call throughout the world that we need volunteers. We need people to come to this area, and we need people to fight this disaster. They were essentially begging people to come. People with experience and knowledge, people who had public health backgrounds were desperately needed to come there. And Kaci Hickox, who is really the hero of this case and the hero of the story, she answered that call. And she volunteered with Doctors Without Borders, and she left her home and she traveled to Bo. Bo is the second biggest city in Sierra Leone, and she spent a considerable amount of time in Bo, Sierra Leone, as a volunteer with Doctors Without Borders, fighting Ebola. The reason that the Ebola virus did not spread all over Africa and all over the world probably is because of volunteers like her that rushed to the scene when all the local public health officials had died and took up the cause and was able to stem this disease before it could spread even further than it did. She is a hero, in my opinion. She was not a neophyte. She had been in over 30 different public health, this is her first Ebola experience, but she'd been in over 30 public health crises throughout the world. And she is, public health is her life, and she dropped what she was doing, as she always does, and she ran to answer this call. Ebola is a very scary disease, as I've discussed, but we do know a lot about it. We don't have a cure. There's several cures that are being investigated currently. There's no cure for it now, but we know about it. We've had 24 Ebola outbreaks since 1976. So we know that the incubation period is no more than 21 days. What that means is that if you have had contact with a Ebola victim, if you don't have Ebola yourself in 21 days, we know you're not going to get it. That's the incubation period. We know that the average incubation period is 10 days, so most people, after 10 days, we know you don't have it. The incubation period, generally there's 2 days before it starts, so we know a lot about if you're going to get it, if you're contagious. We know that before you get Ebola, there are early warning signs, high temperatures, fevers, headaches. And so when people have been in contact with Ebola victims, we look for those early warning symptoms to see if they're at risk. And what we know is that during the early warning stages of Ebola, during the initial sort of headache phase, we know that you're not contagious at all. And we know that if you don't have these early warning symptoms, you don't have Ebola. Kaci Hickox did not have Ebola. Kaci Hickox never got Ebola. Kaci Hickox never had any of the early warning symptoms. And those were all facts that nobody disputes. Just wanted to go over a little bit with you before we go to the rest of the story. This is a picture that Kaci Hickox actually took. This is the Ebola facility in Bo, Sierra Leone, where she volunteered. It was run by Doctors Without Borders. They had fences set up to keep all of the victims of Ebola separated at all times from people who did not have Ebola. By the way, Kaci Hickox herself took most of these pictures, and all the people in her pictures are survivors. She only took pictures of survivors. Any pictures of people who died, she discarded. So everyone you see in these pictures lived because of the people who were out there in Bo, Sierra Leone. As you entered the camp, there were people who disinfected you. So any public health worker coming in or out of the camp had to go through a very serious disinfection regime. In the camp, these are pictures of some of the quarantinings. They were very good about separating people with Ebola from people who weren't. Obviously, they were keeping families apart, but that's what you have to do. These are pictures here of of public health workers. You can see that all of the public health workers who treated Ebola victims Their skin, their eyes, every surface was covered, not once, but in most cases 3 times. So there were tremendous precautions that were taken to deal with the risks. Everybody coming in or out, despite the protective clothing, they were sprayed with disinfectant on the front and on the back. And here you can see that for people who were treating Ebola victims, even after they walked somewhere, there was disinfectant that was placed where their footsteps had been. So these camps were run by professionals, volunteers. They knew what they were doing. They were good people, and they made sure that everything was good. Oh, this is actually a photograph of public health workers and survivors. That's Kaci Hickox all the way on your right. She served in Bo. She saved a lot of lives. She was one of the heroes that kept Ebola from spreading. And after she had done her service, she was tired, she was exhausted. You saw the clothing she had to wear. What I didn't mention is she's wearing that protective clothing, multiple layers and heat that often exceeded 105, 110 degrees. It was very hard work. She missed her fiancé, and when she came back to the United States, she wasn't looking for a ticker tape parade. She didn't want to be recognized as a hero. She was exhausted, she was weary, she was tired. She wanted to go home, she wanted to see her fiancé. Her flight back to the United States landed at Newark International Airport in New Jersey, and this is a picture of Governor Christie, the governor of New Jersey, and he made sure that the minute that Kaci Hickox, the hero of our story, landed in the United States, instead of going to the arms of her fiancé, he had her arrested and quarantined and placed in a quarantine tent where she was imprisoned and not allowed to leave. And Kaci Hickox was not a person who wanted publicity. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to do her job. She wanted to do what she cared about. She was very incensed at being arrested by Governor Christie. Governor Christie was running for president at the time. I don't know if he had formally declared it at that moment, but he had people looking at it. He self-describes himself often as a populist, and some people have suggested, true or false, that Governor Christie thrives on fear. We live in a democracy, votes are important, and people were scared. And if you remember back just a few years, there was panic in this country about Ebola. There were bad things that were happening. People were scared. They saw that the risk of death from Ebola was incredibly high, and the death was a horrible, horrible death. So for the next 3 days after arriving home in this country, instead of being in the arms of her fiancé, Kaci Hickox was in this quarantine against her will. She had some volunteer lawyers come from New York. They negotiated with Governor Christie. They negotiated with the legal authorities in New Jersey, and after 3 days, they cut a deal. And the deal was that she would be allowed out of her quarantine, she would be allowed out of her prison, if you will, as long as she agreed to leave New Jersey, never come back to New Jersey during the 21-day incubation period, and go to her home in Fort Kent, Maine. And she didn't like having to cut a deal like that, but she wanted to go home. She was sick and tired of the situation she was in, so she agreed with the governor of New Jersey. A deal was struck. She could leave New Jersey, and then she could go home, and she thought that was the end of that. What she didn't recognize was that Governor Christie had a friend in Maine, and this is Paul LePage. He's the governor of the state of Maine. Governor Christie called the governor of the state of Maine. I wasn't on the phone at the time, but my understanding is he said, Kaci Hickox is leaving New Jersey. He's coming to Maine. She's coming to Maine. And so the next event in the story is Paul LePage also enters the scene. Paul LePage had won governorship of Maine 4 years before this in a very, very tight election campaign. I think he won only 34, 35% of the vote. This is now October. He is running for election. The election is in November. It is a very, very tight election that Paul LePage is in during this time frame. All the polls are saying that Governor LePage is going to lose. We all know that polls are not always correct. And he is very concerned about being reelected, and whether he acts because of what he believes in or whether he is thriving off of fear, he knows that people in Maine are panicking. In fact, people were panicking. He was right about that. I live in Freeport, Maine. Kaci came to Freeport, Maine, not to visit me, but to visit her fiance's uncle. She couldn't have been there more than 30 minutes when there was a public outcry in my little town, and the town officials in Freeport, Maine issued a press release, everything's okay, but nobody believed it. Anyhow, the minute that Kaci Hickox entered the state of Maine, the governor of Maine, Paul LePage, ordered the state police to have her arrested and quarantined like she'd been in New Jersey. Our attorney general, who does not like our governor, in fact, I've seen this with my own eyes. She has a clock on the wall that lists when the governor's term ends. It goes by each minute. So they are not friends. The Attorney General of Maine called the head of our state police, and I understand said to the head of the state police, do not arrest her. You cannot arrest her. This is a woman who has not committed any crime, and there is no arrest warrant, there is no arrest order allowing her to be arrested. It's my understanding from press reports that the governor said to the state police, you work for me, you don't work for the Attorney General, arrest her. It's my understanding that the Attorney General said to the head of the state police, you work for the rule of law, you can't violate the law, and if you do violate the law, there will be consequences. I was not there for any of those conversations either, but what happened once Kaci Hickox entered the state of Maine is the state police are following her wherever she goes, but they chose not to arrest her. And the Attorney General filed a complaint in the court to have her arrested. This was a quarantine action. These quarantine actions are very, very rare in this country. We saw a bunch of it 100 years ago during the Spanish flu pandemic, but it's not something that we have a lot of experience with legally. The case was actually filed in Fort Kent, Maine, where Kaci Hickox went to live. That's where her fiancé lived. Fort Kent, Maine, for people not familiar with it, is a town of 4,000 people. It's on the Canadian border. It's essentially in Canada, I would think. It has a couple thousand people live there. The people there have a very small courthouse. Before this case, I didn't even know there was a courthouse in Fort Kent, Maine, but I've now seen it. It's a very little courthouse. The only staff in the courthouse is a clerk who serves only half-time, and she reported that on the day that this quarantine case was filed in her little courthouse, she had 7,000 calls. And these were calls coming from all over the country, and people were scared. People were worried that there was going to be an Ebola epidemic in Maine. They were worried there was going to be an Ebola epidemic in America. They didn't know what to think. So the Attorney General's office filed a quarantine complaint in court, and this is the relevant portion of it. Maine has you all know that the United States is something called the Centers for Disease Control. Most states have a very similar institution. Maine has something called the Maine Center for Disease Control. The head of the Maine Center for Disease Control is a political appointee. In fact, when Governor LePage was elected governor of Maine, he fired the former head of the CDC, who, by the way, was the Attorney General's sister, and he appointed a person who had no public health experience whatsoever. And she filed this affidavit in court talking about her 14 years of experience as an osteopathic practicing physician, and said that based on her experience, which actually was no experience, she felt that Kaci Hickox was a threat to the state of Maine. And this garnered a lot of public attention and a lot of outcry. And away we went. This was an emergency case to imprison Kaci Hickox a woman who had no signs whatsoever of Ebola. She was not contagious. She was not sick. The only thing she had done was answer the call from the world, run to Sierra Leone, help stop an epidemic in its tracks, and come back not wanting publicity, but just wanting actually some quiet time to reflect and be by yourself. In Maine, we don't have a lot of cases about epidemics. We don't have a lot of cases about quarantine. That's the understatement. This was our first ever. This, under the Maine statute, these cases go to what's called the Maine District Court. The Maine District Court is, I don't mean to demean the Maine District Court, but it is a lower level court. It's a court that specializes in traffic actions. It handles misdemeanors. It will handle divorces. And in this case, in addition to handling traffic infractions and misdemeanors, Judge Charles Laverdiere was given a worldwide case involving whether to quarantine Kaci Hickox. And he was getting calls right and left. The newspapers, this was a front page issue, not just in Maine, it was a front page issue in Boston, it was front pages in New York, what to do with a woman who had been treating people in Sierra Leone, had come back to America, had no signs of any disease. Do we put her in jail? And people were scared, and there was no doubt about it. In fact, the initial discussions with Charles Laverdiere went actually very poorly for me. Kaci Hickox was being arrested, and there was going to be a trial to talk about whether she should be arrested. And one of the things I asked for is that she be allowed to be at her trial and testify at her trial and be able to confront the witnesses against her. And as you probably all recall, the United States Constitution and the Maine Constitution both say that a person being arrested or imprisoned has a right to confront their accusers. This was not a new idea. This came up with the founding of this country in the Bill of Rights. Judge Laverdiere ruled at the early stages of the case that he would hold a trial and that Kaci Hickox was not going to be allowed to be at the trial in person. And so obviously, if he was scared to let her be in the courtroom, I had grave concerns about which way he was going to go at the trial. He did say that she could testify by audiovisual means, which, being over 25, I had zero faith in. Just barely over 25. And so it wasn't going very well, and the panic was all over the place. In fact, several newspapers reported that the governor was actually reelected. Our trial actually takes place on election day and the day before. And so a lot of the governor was successfully reelected, and much of the media credited his reelection to defending the people of Maine fighting an Ebola, a make-believe Ebola virus. The Ebola was not make-believe, but the suggestion that Kaci Hickox was in any way, shape, or form contaminated was completely made up, and it was false science. Judge Laverdiere was a judge also that I had known but had no experience with. I love trials. I don't do a lot of divorce or traffic infractions. And the initial battles with him were not promising, but it was clear to me that we had a man who was going to rise to the occasion. He was highly intelligent. He cared deeply about what he did. He was scared, but he also listened, and he listened very carefully. And he understood that while Ebola is a horrible, horrible thing, that Kaci Hickox did not have Ebola. Kaci Hickox, as a volunteer with Doctors Without Borders, made sure that she was tested twice a day for all the symptoms of Ebola. And she had agreed from day one that if she ever had any symptoms, that she would voluntarily quarantine herself. She always said that. She never wavered from that. That's required by Doctors Without Borders. I believe it's also required by the Centers for Disease Control. She always said that she would quarantine herself if she had any sign. By the way, these signs are like headaches. So obviously people can have headaches without having Ebola. She said, if I ever get a headache, if I ever get a temperature, if I ever get a cold, I will voluntarily quarantine myself. But I do not think it's fair to me. I do not think it's fair to the public health workers of this nation and of this world to be treated like a criminal for doing what she thought was right and honest. And the trial we started, and we never finished. Actually, one of my key witnesses who never testified was the former head of the Center for Disease Control, who was, again, the sister of our Attorney General. So my next witness was going to be the former head of the Center for Disease Control saying this is ridiculous, and she was going to be cross-examined by her best friend and sister, which was sort of an awkward situation. But we were ready to go, and we got there, and Judge Laverdiere announced that he couldn't sleep. He said that he had been up all night, and he hadn't been able to sleep at all. The whole night he was plagued by this case. He thought about it and thought about it, and he said, I'm going to issue a decision which is not my final decision, but it's a decision which we would live with until he made his final decision, a temporary decision, pending the final. And he read it to all of us, and as he read his decision, he started to cry, or his voice started to creak. And I think by the time he'd finished, everybody in the audience was in tears. He said, this decision has critical implications for Kaci Hickox's freedom, respondent by Kaci Hickox, as guaranteed by the U.S. and Maine constitutions, as well as the public right to be protected from potentially severe harm. He said repeatedly that Kaci Hickox currently does not show any symptoms of Ebola and is therefore not infectious. He said that the court needs to make some observations. He said, we would not be here today unless Kaci Hickox generously, kindly, and with compassion lent her skills to aid, comfort, and care for individuals stricken with a terrible disease. We need to remember as we go through this matter that we owe her and all professionals who give up of themselves a debt of gratitude. And he also said, having said that Kaci Hickox should understand that the court is fully aware of the misconceptions, misinformation, bad science, and bad information being spread not just from Maine, but from shore to shore in our country with respect to Ebola. The court is fully aware that people are acting out of fear, and that this fear, as he put it, is not entirely rational. He also said, however, whether fear is rational or not, it is present and it is real. And he said that as long as Kaci Hickox, he did require her to continue doing her twice-day tests, which we had no problem with. But he said that as long as she did that, and he knew she would, because she was a nurse, she cared about what she was doing, that he would not imprison her during the time that the trial was going on. And by the time he had read this, everybody in the audience was wet-eyed, and the Attorney General turned and said, this case is over. I'm not going forward another minute. We are settling it, and we are agreeing that whatever the judge said is a temporary order is now a permanent order, and that was okay. Apparently, I wasn't there. I heard the governor jumping up and saying, no, you can't do that. You don't speak for the state of Maine, and I understand this is all my understanding. The Attorney General said in their private conversation, yes, I do speak for the state of Maine. I'm the Attorney General, and this case ends, and it ends now. So it ended with a good result in that a person who was being hounded for helping Ebola victims, a person who had no symptoms of Ebola, had a trial, or until it was over, and the court found that she did not have to be arrested. She did not have to be quarantined. She was free as long as she didn't have any symptoms. I think we got lucky. We got a judge that rose to the occasion. You know, America has this great history of you go to somebody who has not had this responsibility, you give them responsibility. It's not always true, but I find it's more true than not that when you give this great responsibility on somebody, especially an intelligent person, they rise to the occasion, and the judge did do that in this case. But I very much continue to be worried about what's going to happen the next time. I mean, I've tried to briefly outline. Public hysteria comes and it goes. For people who are traveling to the Caribbean, you probably noticed that your airplane tickets are 75% off. You probably noticed that the hotels in the Caribbean are 90% empty, and that's because of fear of the Zika virus, which has actually entered America's shores, is a serious issue in Puerto Rico, and has infiltrated into areas in South Florida. That's one that might be the next one. SARS in the last epidemic killed 775 people, 44 of them in Canada. H1N1, for those people who remember that from 2009, we had hundreds of thousands of sick people. In America, for some reason, there's a love of monster movies. There's a love of fear. Psychologists, of which I'm not one, call this a dread factor. And this is something that in the public health community, I think needs to be confronted. And I think public health professionals and public health lawyers need to figure out now what we're going to do. During the Ebola scare, Dr. Kent Brantley was an American doctor who, in fact, did have Ebola. He got it treating patients in Liberia. He went to Emory University for treatment, Emory University Hospital, right next to the CDC, or across the street from the CDC, and there was panic all over Atlanta. Because Emory was treating somebody who had Ebola, Atlanta went into a panic. At the time, I read a news report that did caution people and said you need to be rational. And there was a great quote that Kim Kardashian has had more husbands than Americans have died of Ebola. But the panic was there. There was a Liberian at the time named Thomas Duncan. He went into a Dallas hospital. He had Ebola. They did not diagnose it at Texas Presbyterian. He was given antibiotics and told to go home. He later came back to the hospital and died. 2 nurses got infected. There was widespread panic all over Texas. And Texas Presbyterian Hospital, within 3 days of the hospital announcing that 2 of their nurses had been infected, half of the hospital was empty. The patients walked out. The staff refused to go to work. And this is where we're dealing with. I will say, in Maine, after this case came in, practically every epidemiologist in the state of Maine, there's not a lot of them, but there's good ones, and virtually every infectious disease doctor called me or called my office and said, whatever you need, I'll volunteer and do it for free. We had a real outpouring in the medical profession and in the nursing profession, the head of the Maine Nursing Association as well, saying, what can we do to help? We know that this woman is a hero, not contagious. And I think that's important. And I think the lessons that we learned from the Ebola scare, which we will absolutely need in the future, because there's plagues coming and coming, is that we need to find some way to organize. We need to find some way that we can be ready for it, that people who are in the public health profession, that people who are public health lawyers, people who are epidemiologists, people who are infectious disease doctors and nurses can be ready so that when this comes, we can announce that this person needs to be quarantined, this person doesn't need to be quarantined. I am not against quarantining people who are contagious and who have diseases that can spread throughout the United States society. But what I am adamantly against is the quarantining and imprisoning of people who are not contagious, who, because of people's irrational fear, because of bad science and junk science, which I guess is like bad news or something, I don't know. We need to find a way that we can react to this and move quickly and have people available to talk to the press and talk to the CDC and volunteer for cases so that we can spread we can prevent the spread of irrational fear. But sorry, I know I've been longer than I was, but I'm honored and delighted to take people's questions and talk in more detail about some of the heroes and some of the villains of a story that I'm just trying to touch on very briefly. Yeah. I have plenty of time, yes. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you, why did the Attorney General do what she did in filing the papers, and why did the Director of Public Health say what the Director of Public Health said? So you were able to come to the facts pretty quickly, right? Why,
yes,
why
with
weren't
the
they
help of
able
all the
to?
public health professionals out there.
Right, so
The head of the Maine CDC was an appointee of the governor. She was a new appointee of the governor. I don't know her well. Sheila Panett is her name. I know everything about her background. She had never treated an infectious disease in her life, according to people that talked about it. I fear, I'm sure she'll take a different position, did what she did because she was doing it at the governor's request.
And what about the AG?
The AG clearly was not a friend of the governor, but she felt that she had some obligation. The governor has ordering her to do something about this. And even though she didn't like the governor, and even though she doesn't always do what the governor says, I think she tries to do the right thing and at least mounted a case. And it was actually a very vigorous case, and she was personally involved in the case herself. She didn't just send people, she did send other people, but she was heavily involved in the case. And I think she figured we'll go to the court system, and whatever the courts do, it's out of my hands, perhaps. She was very distressed that my top witness was her sister, I think. And her sister was distressed as well, because they do like each other, but both felt they had an obligation to do what they did. Yes, I very much, I know that they were spending a lot of time talking, but they didn't invite me. Yes, so I'm sorry. Well,
Thank you so much, and thank you for telling this as a story, and the story from the perspective of Kaci, which we didn't ever really get. And I think one of the things that you've touched on is the press and journalism, and that they were part of the problem, and they're also part of the solution. And I keep thinking of that photograph, or I keep remembering a photograph of her being followed while she's on her bike with her fiance down a kind of lonely road in Maine. And there are two ways to interpret that photograph from a journalist point of view: that she's out there being irresponsible and this is more hype, or that she is being unfairly persecuted and followed. But the question that I have for you is, to follow up on what you were saying toward the end, is journalism does have a role to play in stopping these kinds of threats and trying to interact with public health and with legal professionals in a more responsible way. And do you have any thoughts about sort of how we can reach out to them and work with them in a more proactive way than just figuring, anybody reacts, and whether they're responsible or not responsible or ethical or non-ethical or whatever?
well, I think the bicycle incident might have been partly my own fault. I mean, I had been talking to the state, and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do among ourselves. And I said, look, would it work if in the meantime she just didn't go to any she didn't go to any crowded places? There are no crowded places in Fort Kent, Maine. But look, she'll stay out of restaurants, she'll stay out of stores, she'll stay out of all those things. And the state attorney general's office was saying, okay, why don't we just do that? Bicycling was, when she went bicycling by herself. She didn't contact anyone other than her fiance and the 50 or so state police that chose to follow her. So yes, there were some journalists there. She wasn't making a public statement. She was exercising. I also bicycle. And I didn't think that was clearly, our agreement was not an agreement, it was an understanding, but she was allowed to go bicycling. And so that's all she was doing. But you're right, the press interpreted it as thumbing her nose at the people of Maine or the people of America, and that wasn't what she was doing at all. I don't like talking to the press and meeting with the press. I don't dislike it, it's just something I don't tend to have time for. But I did in this case try to talk to a lot of press people who I knew to try to get the message out that this is junk science and there is no danger. I think some press people reported it. I think most were selling media and papers, and people were scared, and they always had very damaging headlines and always had people showing people dead of Ebola. And I kept saying, yes, that might be a person dead of Ebola, but this person has no Ebola. So we do need the press to help out. You might have more confidence in the press than I do. I have some close friends that are reporters, but they do want to sell newspapers, or to the extent anyone buys them anymore. So, I'm sorry.
How did you get involved in this case?
I do a lot of trials. They are not Ebola trials, but more or less, I probably do more constitutional cases in Maine than anybody else. I don't know that for sure, but that's my sense of it. And so when the New York lawyers who had been helping her in New Jersey, when this case came up in Maine, they heard about me or they knew me, and they called and asked me if I could be in court in 5 minutes. And I was already in court anyhow when they called. So I said, sure. And you never know when you get involved in these stories if it's going to be big or small, but the fun thing about life is you jump at it and see what happens. So yes, it was just by reputation, I guess. So. Oh, sorry, Wendy. Oh.
Thank you. Again, a wonderful description. As you point out that there will be new epidemics, there will be new plagues, and people may panic. Is there anything we can do to try and prevent some kind of instinctive reaction to lock people up on the off chance that they might be sick or contagious? I'm reminded of a comment by an infectious disease physician speaking on the topic a while ago. It says, when someone recommends an intervention out of an abundance of caution, you can be sure it's not needed. So that's often the question we have here, right? We're going to do this out of an abundance of caution to protect the public. How do we know when that's totally unnecessary, and how can we convince the public that they're not being threatened if people are not immediately locked up on mere suspicion?
We can do that now by preparing in advance. We are going to have another epidemic. We are going to have another plague. My grandfather was a doctor in the Spanish flu pandemic that killed 25 million people in 1918. He was a doctor being shipped off to France to be a medical care for Americans in World War I, and he never got to France. They shipped him instead to Alabama, where he dealt with tens of thousands of U.S. servicemen, doughboys he called them, that had Spanish flu, and people were terrified. But what we need to do is figure out now how we're going to do this. We need to figure out guidelines. The guidelines we have today, there are federal guidelines, and each state has their own guidelines. Probably best to have one set of uniform guidelines throughout the country. And I think it should say, who are we going to quarantine and who are we not going to quarantine? Right now they say anyone can be quarantined basically if the president or the head of HHS or CDC or a state feels that this person is a public health risk. Well, what does that mean? I mean, we know now that the light of day has come that Kaci Hickox is not a public health risk. But we know that now, and I knew we were going to know that, but at the time it was very hard to convince people. I'm sitting there with the judge and saying she's not a public health risk, and he's listening and he's beginning to buy it. And then I say, well, can she come to the trial? And he says, absolutely not. So, there's still that fear. So I think we need to have the guidelines now and hopefully elect leaders that will follow the guidelines. Sorry, Dean.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It was really interesting. So on August 1st, 2014, a private citizen tweeted out, "The US cannot allow Ebola-infected people back. People that go to faraway places to help out are great, but must suffer the consequences." Now, the private citizen, of course, is now president. So my question is, given that the president has declared what he thought then, to what extent do you think this case will help protect non-infectious people in Indiana or Idaho next time something like this happens in the next year? Or to what extent is this going to have to be refought from scratch all over again, perhaps made worse by a president who feels strongly on this issue?
Well, we'll have to refight it for sure, but hopefully the message will go out. I mean, after this judge made this ruling, there was still an Ebola scare, and there were still movements to arrest all sorts of people who the nurses in Texas had come in contact with. The nurses, there was a movement to arrest the nurses themselves. No state after this case prosecuted another person for quarantining because I think this message went out, that this was junk science. And this decision, scribbled by the judge on a piece of paper, went out, and hopefully that message got out to the courts and the judges so this won't happen again. I do think that the president is correct that if you go to treat someone that has Ebola, and if you do have the warning signs of Ebola, you should, as Doctors Without Borders require, you should agree to quarantine yourself. But the difference is how it's enforced. And Kaci Hickox always said, hey, if I ever find out I have Ebola, if I even find out I have a headache, I agree to be quarantined, but it's an enforcement issue. And that is that you shouldn't quarantine or arrest people until you pass that threshold. I was trying to move quickly, and I apologize if I moved too quickly. I tried to show all the safety precautions that the public health officials use in dealing with Ebola today. Very few of the public health workers who came, not the initial ones, but the ones who came after they knew this was an Ebola health outbreak, very few of those people got sick because they knew what they were doing. So I think we need to make a distinction between people contagious and people who are not. We need to make a distinction between rational issues and bad science and fear. And a lot of that is leadership, but guidelines I think would help. And I understand Wendy is involved in drafting some of those, so that might be good as well. Or recommending some. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
So one of the things that's interesting about this case and other similar cases of infectious disease is the thought that there's something bad about the person who has it, that that they don't really care about going out and infecting everybody. I mean, so the person, it's not just the disease that gets seen as bad, but the person gets seen as bad. And so even the notion that she would self-quarantine herself is kind of an odd notion, because what she would do is get treatment. Right? The point is that she doesn't want to die. This was also true of the doctor in New York, that the reason why they take their temperature and follow all those guidelines is because it's in their self-interest. It's not just a matter of public health. And so it strikes me that it's the demonization of the people who are potentially sick, right? That they're seen as the threat instead of the disease.
Right, Kaci Hickox, I'm sure she didn't want to die, but she's also a health professional. She'd been in public health her whole life. The last thing she wanted to do was spread the disease that she would committed part of her life to stopping.
And as soon as she had symptoms, she wouldn't stay at home, I assume. She would go to the hospital.
That's right, and she would go to and they were organized throughout the country. Certain hospitals in Nebraska and Atlanta, even in Boston, we're talking about it, where people could go who had those special needs, and she was fully prepared to do that. They were ambulances that around this country that were fitted to, like McGrady Hospital in Atlanta had special ambulances to transport Ebola victims, and she was ready, willing, and able to do it, but only if it was based on rational issues, not when it was based on fear. And she wanted to protect her fellow public health workers as well from this, and because this was pretty discouraging. If you decide you want to go over there and fight Ebola, and you're going to come back to this irrational hatred, you might just say, you know what, I'm not going to do that.
Where is she now?
She moved to Portland, Oregon. She became the head of 7 public health clinics in Portland, Oregon, and she is now on the verge of getting a new job with the federal government. I don't know if the president is aware of that, dealing with stemming infections on the West Coast. Sorry, George, I said you have. Oh. And there was a press release about this talk, and she saw it in the newspaper, and she called me last night to say she regretted that. I had previously said, you know what, instead of me speaking, why don't you come? And she wasn't able to.
So this is a good story. Still trying to decide whether Ebola in the United States is a bad public health story or a good public health story. Because we didn't have much Ebola, and that's a success. But we did overreact. We actually put a lawyer in charge. You may remember, we took Tom Frieden off the case and put Ron Klain in charge of the Ebola response in the United States. And when the president has to do that, you know something weird is going on, right? On the other hand, the CDC just released their data that 25,000 Americans were put under observation and or quarantine. They don't really define what that means for Ebola. Like Casey said, she would do to herself. And most of those, I take it, were self-reporting. None of them had Ebola. So does that mean we overreacted or underreacted or reacted just right? And none of them went to court. I mean, I understand Casey really didn't go to court. She was kind of forced into it. And does that mean Americans are too passive, that we're willing to do whatever the public health people tell us to do?
Well, we did overreact, but it's also a good story.
It's both.
But it's not a good story because we had a good president or a bad president. It's a good story because people along the way in the story stood up to the villains and said, no, we could lynch those 20 witches in Salem, but we're not going to do it this time. We could react like we did with the AIDS panic or the panics with Red Scares, but at the end of the day, we decided no, that this time we're going to react the right way. And there were other voluntary quarantines throughout the United States, but this was the only one where there was a fight. Because Kaci Hickox said, she was arrested for 3 days already at this point.
No, I understand. She was treated differently than everybody else.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And she also made a big point about, and I don't know if it's true or not, but she said the people that were in Africa treating Africans were treated very differently than the nurses in America treating Americans.
Fair point.
So, see, I never did the statistics, but the people treating the 2 nurses in Texas were not quarantined. You know, so she said, "What's?" And she didn't want them to be, but just like she was glad they weren't. But it was like, "What's different about me?" I mean, there were no symptoms for any of the people. So, sorry, Wendy.
On that point, on non-grand epidemic scale, but often with tuberculosis, people who may have tuberculosis, they are often petitioned to be quarantined or involuntarily detained. But a disproportionate number, if not the vast majority, are people of color, immigrants, poor, and I wonder if there's a difference because Kaci Hickox was a nice young white professional woman.
I don't know. Tuberculosis my grandfather actually was a pulmonary doctor in the 1890s, 1900s, treating tuberculosis primarily because it was a scourge in New York at those days. And there, the people having it were all white. Today, it's very different. But, I mean, perhaps there's a difference. But I do know that there was panic. And the panic, even though based on false facts, was real. And people were scared, and that's what created the problem. After I took the case, people in my own office were complaining about it, that I could spread Ebola through the office. And at that point, all I ever done was talk to Casey on the telephone. And I said, well, what do you want to do, disinfect the telephone? But, I don't know who was complaining, but it was reported to me by the head of my office that there was a big issue and people were concerned, and I just ignored them and nothing happened, so. Yes, so. And I never got Ebola, and my phone is in really good shape. Yes, so. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for your caring and your love in hearing a story. Thank you.